Picture this: the year is 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire. A civilization that dominated the known world for over a millennium ceased to exist in what historians describe as a matter of days, not decades, not years, days. But here's the part that should terrify you. Rome didn't fall because of barbarians at the gates. It fell because of something far more insidious, something that's happening right now in economies around the world. The empire collapsed from within, and the final blow came from a place most Romans never expected: their wallets. What if I told you that every economic lesson we need to survive the coming decades is hidden in the rubble of history's greatest empires? That the same patterns that destroyed Rome, the Soviet Union, and countless civilizations are playing out right now, and most people have no idea they're even at risk. Today, we're going to examine the brutal truth about economic collapse and why understanding Rome's fall might be the most valuable 30 minutes you spend this year. Welcome back to The Economic Philosopher, where we explore the intersection of history, psychology, and economics to understand the forces shaping our financial future. The statement that Rome fell in 3 days is deliberately provocative, but it contains a profound truth that economists and historians have debated for centuries. While the Roman Empire's decline was centuries in the making, the actual moment of collapse, when the last Western Roman emperor was deposed in 476 AD, happened with stunning speed. One day, there was an empire. 3 days later, there wasn't. This creates a fascinating paradox. How does a superpower that took centuries to build vanish in less time than it takes most of us to plan a weekend trip? More importantly, what does this tell us about our own economic systems, our currencies, and the stability we take for granted? The problem is this: we've been taught to think about economic collapse as a gradual process, something we'll see coming with plenty of time to prepare. But history reveals a different pattern. Economic systems don't erode linearly. They remain stable, even appear invincible, right up until the moment they don't. And when that moment comes, the collapse is breathtakingly fast. Today's exploration will give you a framework for understanding economic vulnerability that goes far beyond textbook economics. We'll examine how currency debasement, fiscal irresponsibility, and psychological factors combine to create perfect storms of economic destruction. We'll look at the warning signs that preceded history's greatest economic collapses. And crucially, we'll explore what this means for you, your wealth, and your financial future in an era where similar patterns are emerging globally. This isn't just ancient history. This is a masterclass in economic survival. Let's start by dismantling a myth. When most people think about the fall of Rome, they imagine hordes of barbarians, overwhelming Roman legions in epic battles. While military defeats played a role, they were symptoms, not causes. The real story of Rome's collapse is an economic tragedy that unfolded over centuries before culminating in those final chaotic days. The Roman economy in the 2nd century AD was arguably the most sophisticated the world had ever seen. Trade routes spanned 3 continents, a single currency. The denarius facilitated commerce from Britain to Egypt. Property rights were protected. Infrastructure was unmatched. The Pax Romana had created unprecedented stability and prosperity. But beneath this glittering surface, something was rotting. It started with currency debasement, one of the oldest and most destructive economic sins in human history. During the reign of Nero in the 1st century AD, the silver content of the denarius was 98%. By the time of Emperor Gallienus in 265 AD, it had plummeted to just 5%. The government was literally diluting the currency, replacing silver with base metals while insisting each coin had the same value. Think about what this means. Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that your dollar bills are now made of paper. That's 95% recycled cardboard, but everyone's supposed to pretend they're worth the same as before. That's not a hypothetical. That's what happened to Roman citizens over generations. The economic logic seemed sound to desperate emperors. Rome faced mounting expenses, endless wars on multiple frontiers, a bloated bureaucracy, and the enormous cost of keeping the urban poor pacified with free bread and entertainment. The famous panem et circenses, revenue was falling as the empire's productive capacity declined. The solution? Create more money. But here's where economic reality intrudes on political convenience. You cannot create wealth by debasing currency. You can only redistribute existing wealth, stealing it from savers and fixed-income citizens, while creating the illusion of prosperity. The Roman government was engaged in systematic theft from its own people, and the people eventually figured it out. Gresham's law kicked in with devastating effect. The principle is simple. Bad money drives out good money. When Roman citizens realized their coins were being debased, anyone holding old high silver content coins hoarded them or melted them down. The high-quality money disappeared from circulation, replaced by increasingly worthless tokens. The government's attempt to maintain the fiction that new coins equaled old ones became impossible to sustain. Prices spiraled upward. Emperor Diocletian, facing runaway inflation in 301 AD, did what desperate governments always do: imposed price controls. His edict on maximum prices fixed the cost of over 1,000 goods and services, with death as the penalty for violations. It failed spectacularly. Markets don't care about government edicts. When official prices are below what sellers need to survive, goods simply vanish. The archaeological record shows evidence of widespread shortages and the growth of black markets where real prices were paid in goods or in older, more valuable coins. The economic crisis triggered a cascade of failures. Tax revenues, calculated in increasingly worthless currency, couldn't fund the government's operations. To compensate, the empire imposed ever heavier taxation in kind, confiscating a portion of every harvest, every workshop's production. This destroyed incentives for productivity. Why work harder when the government will just take more? Agricultural production, the foundation of the ancient economy, declined precipitously. The archaeological evidence is stark. Pollen samples show massive reforestation in previously cultivated areas across the empire. Farmland was literally reverting to wilderness because farming was no longer economically viable. Rural populations fled to cities or beyond the empire's borders. The tax base shrank, forcing even higher tax rates on those who remained, creating a death spiral. Trade, which had knit the empire together, collapsed. Without a stable medium of exchange, long-distance commerce became nearly impossible. Regions that had specialized in producing goods for export reverted to subsistence economies. The sophisticated economic web that had made Rome great unraveled into isolated, impoverished localities. Military effectiveness suffered as the economic foundation crumbled. Soldiers, paid in debased currency, could buy less and less. Morale plummeted. Discipline eroded. The empire increasingly relied on barbarian mercenaries who were loyal only as long as they were paid. When the money ran out, so did their loyalty. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was a hollow shell. The provinces had largely gone their own way, recognizing local strongmen rather than distant emperors who couldn't protect them or maintain order. The city of Rome itself, once home to over 1 million people, had shrunk to perhaps 50,000. The infrastructure was crumbling. The economy had regressed centuries. This is the context for those final days in 476 AD. The last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was a teenager. His rule was a fiction maintained by his father, a military commander. When the Germanic general Odoacer decided he wanted direct control rather than ruling through a puppet, there was no resistance. Romulus was deposed, pensioned off to a villa, and the office of Western Roman Emperor simply ceased to exist. No great battle, no dramatic last stand, just a quiet acknowledgement that the empire was already dead. The collapse looked sudden, but it was the culmination of centuries of economic mismanagement. The lesson: economic systems can appear stable long after they've become fundamentally unsound. And when the illusion finally shatters, the end comes with shocking speed. To understand why Rome fell the way it did, we need to examine the philosophical underpinnings of economic systems and why they're far more fragile than they appear. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle identified a concept he called the golden mean, the idea that virtue lies between extremes. In economic terms, this translates to balance between consumption and production, between present enjoyment and future security, between monetary expansion and monetary stability. Rome's tragedy was the abandonment of this balance in favor of short-term political expediency. Every Roman emperor who debased the currency understood, at some level, that it was destructive, but they faced an immediate political calculus: pay the armies and maintain power today, or preserve the currency's integrity and risk immediate overthrow. They chose survival, and each emperor's individual choice, rational in isolation, contributed to systemic catastrophe. This is what philosophers call the tragedy of the commons, but applied to time rather than space. Each generation of Roman leadership borrowed from the future to solve present problems. They consumed the empire's accumulated capital, both economic and social, without replenishing it. Eventually, there was nothing left to borrow against. The Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote extensively about the importance of living within one's means, of distinguishing between genuine wealth and mere appearance. His words were largely ignored by the imperial government, which prioritized appearance over substance. The facade of power was maintained long after the reality had evaporated. There's a deeper philosophical principle at work here. Complex systems fail in nonlinear ways. The Roman economy wasn't like a car gradually running out of gas. It was like a bridge with hidden structural damage. For years, it carried the weight. People crossed it daily without concern. Engineers assured everyone it was safe. And then, one ordinary day, it collapsed. This nonlinearity is what makes economic collapse so dangerous and so difficult to predict. Systems don't fail gradually. They fail suddenly, often triggered by events that seem minor in isolation. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus was administratively trivial, one military leader, replacing another. But it symbolized and finalized a process that had been building for centuries. The philosopher Nassim Taleb, in our modern era, calls these black swan events outcomes that are rare, unpredictable, and catastrophic. But Taleb argues that true black swans are actually less common than we think. What appear to be sudden, unpredictable collapses are usually the culmination of hidden vulnerabilities. Rome's fall wasn't a black swan. It was the predictable result of known weaknesses that everyone chose to ignore. This brings us to a crucial philosophical question. Why do societies ignore obvious warning signs of impending collapse? The answer lies in a combination of normalcy bias, the assumption that because something has always worked, it always will, and what economists call temporal discounting, our tendency to heavily discount future consequences in favor of immediate benefits. Roman citizens in 400 AD had lived their entire lives in the empire. Their parents and grandparents had too. The idea that it could simply cease to exist was psychologically unthinkable. Even as the evidence mounted barbarian kingdoms effectively independent within supposed imperial territory. Imperial authority ignored or laughed at. The economy in shambles, the assumption persisted that this was temporary, that Rome would endure as it always had. The philosopher Edmund Burke, reflecting on the French Revolution centuries later, noted that society is a partnership, not just between the living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. Each generation inherits obligations and responsibilities. The late Roman leadership violated this partnership, consuming capital built by previous generations and leaving nothing for those who would follow. This creates a moral dimension to economic policy that we often ignore. Currency debasement isn't just a technical monetary policy, it's a form of theft across time, stealing from savers, from those on fixed incomes, and ultimately from future generations who inherit a degraded economic system. The Roman example teaches us that economic systems require what we might call economic virtua, commitment to long-term sustainability over short-term, political advantage, to honest money over convenient inflation, to building productive capacity rather than just redistributing existing wealth. When these virtues are abandoned, collapse becomes inevitable. The only question is timing. Let's examine the psychological dimension of economic collapse, because understanding the mental frameworks that prevent people from recognizing danger is as important as understanding the economic mechanics themselves. In the decades before Rome's final collapse, there's no evidence of widespread panic or fear among the general population. Life continued, markets operated, people made plans for the future. This isn't because the warning signs weren't visible, they were everywhere. It's because the human mind has remarkable abilities to normalize even the most abnormal circumstances. Psychologists identify several cognitive biases that blind us to systemic risks. The first is normalcy bias, which we've already mentioned, but it goes deeper than simple assumption of continuity. Normalcy bias is our brain's way of managing anxiety. Recognizing existential threats creates unbearable stress, so our minds defensively minimize or ignore evidence of danger. Consider a Roman merchant. In 450 AD, he lives in a city where basic services are breaking down. Aqueducts are crumbling because there's no money to maintain them. The military can't guarantee safe travel between cities. The currency is so debased that many transactions happen through barter. And yet, he goes about his business planning for next year's trading season. Because the alternative, accepting that the entire system is collapsing, is too psychologically painful, this is compounded by what psychologists call the Dunning-Kruger effect in reverse. The most informed citizens, those who actually understood economic principles, recognized the danger, but they were a tiny minority. The vast majority, with little understanding of currency mechanics or fiscal policy, simply couldn't grasp what was happening. They saw prices rising and assumed merchants were greedy. They saw shortages and blamed hoarders. They never understood that these were symptoms of monetary collapse. There's also a phenomenon called pluralistic ignorance, where everyone privately questions whether things are okay. But because no one else is openly panicking, each person assumes they must be wrong to worry. This creates a collective delusion of stability. The Roman government actively encouraged this delusion through propaganda. Imperial proclamations insisted everything was fine. Coins were minted with images of victory and prosperity, even as the empire was crumbling. This official optimism, backed by the authority of the state, made it psychologically difficult for individuals to trust their own observations. We see similar patterns in every economic collapse throughout history. In the Soviet Union's final years, most citizens had no idea the country was about to cease existing. The government's pervasive control of information meant most people were genuinely shocked when the USSR dissolved in 1991. Yet to outside observers, and to Soviet leadership itself, the collapse had been obvious for years. The 2008 financial crisis provides a more recent example. The housing bubble was visible to anyone looking at the data. Household debt levels were unsustainable. Lending standards had collapsed. But the vast majority of people, including many financial professionals, assumed everything was fine right up until Lehman Brothers collapsed and the global financial system nearly went with it. Why? Because most people operate on what psychologists call System 1, thinking fast, intuitive, based on immediate observation and recent experience. Your System 1 thinking says, I have a job, my investments are growing, the economy seems fine. System 2, thinking slow, analytical, considering long-term trends and systemic risks, requires effort. Most people don't engage it for economic questions because they assume experts are handling it. But what if the experts are either wrong or incentivized to lie? What if the system is designed to hide its own fragility? This brings us to a darker psychological reality: willful blindness. There's evidence that many in Roman leadership understood the empire was failing, but continued policies of currency, debasement, and fiscal irresponsibility, because stopping would require sacrifices that would cost them power. They chose to extract what they could, while they could, and let future generations deal with the consequences. This pattern of elite knowledge, combined with public ignorance, creates a dangerous dynamic. Those with the clearest view of systemic risks are often those with the most to gain from the status quo continuing just a little longer. They become invested in maintaining the illusion of stability, even as they personally prepare for collapse. The psychological lesson for us today is clear. Do not assume that because markets are functioning, currencies are accepted, and daily life continues normally, that systemic stability exists. These are lagging indicators. By the time obvious dysfunction appears, the underlying structural damage may already be irreparable. We must overcome our cognitive biases, our normalcy bias, and our pluralistic ignorance. We must think in terms of systems and long-term trends rather than just immediate experience. And we must accept that those in authority often have incentives to mislead us about systemic risks. The Romans, who recognized what was happening early enough, could take steps to protect themselves, converting wealth to land or portable valuables, relocating to more stable regions, developing skills that would retain value in a collapse scenario. Those who trusted that someone else would fix the problems lost everything. Now we arrive at the uncomfortable part, examining how the patterns that destroyed Rome are recurring in modern economies and what this means for your financial future. Let's start with currency debasement, because it's happening right now on a scale that would make Roman emperors envious. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet was less than $1 trillion before the 2008 financial crisis. Today, it exceeds $8 trillion. That's not counting the trillions created during the COVID pandemic. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and central banks worldwide have followed similar policies of massive monetary expansion. This is the modern equivalent of reducing the silver content of the denarius. We don't physically debase coins anymore, but the effect is identical. Each new dollar, euro, or yen created dilutes the value of existing currency. The mechanism is different, but the economic reality is the same. Governments and central banks justify this through various economic theories: Keynesian stimulus, monetary policy accommodation, preventing deflation. But strip away the technical language, and you're left with the same core dynamic. Governments creating money to fund expenditures they cannot pay for through taxation or borrowing. The consequences are also familiar. Asset prices inflate rapidly while purchasing power erodes. Those who own stocks, real estate, or other hard assets see their nominal wealth increase. Those relying on wages or savings denominated in currency see their real wealth decline. This creates massive wealth inequality, similar to the vast gap between Roman patricians, who could protect themselves through land and tangible assets, and the plebeians, who relied on increasingly worthless wages. Consider housing costs in major cities. In many Western nations, housing prices have increased 3 to 5 times faster than wages over the past few decades. This isn't because houses have become dramatically better or because land has become scarcer. It's because monetary expansion inflates asset prices. Young people today face a situation similar to late-period Roman citizens. A basic necessity of life housing then. Housing now has become economically unattainable for an increasing portion of the population. Governments respond with policies eerily reminiscent of Diocletian's price controls, rent control, affordable housing mandates, zoning restrictions intended to lower prices. Like their Roman predecessors, these interventions treat symptoms rather than causes, often making problems worse by reducing supply or creating perverse incentives. The fiscal situation is even more alarming. The United States carries over $33 trillion in official federal debt, with unfunded liabilities for programs like Social Security and Medicare estimated at over $100 trillion. This is mathematically unpayable through any plausible combination of taxation and economic growth. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio exceeds 250%. Many European nations face similar or worse situations. These numbers represent obligations to future generations that current governments have no intention or ability to honor. The late Roman pattern of consuming capital and leaving nothing for the future is repeating on a global scale. The standard response is that modern economies are different, that fiat currency systems managed by professional central bankers are fundamentally more stable than ancient coinage. But this is precisely the normalcy bias we discussed. Every civilization in decline believed it was different, that it had transcended the historical patterns that destroyed previous societies. We even see the same breakdown in economic complexity. Just-in-time supply chains, which worked wonderfully in stable times, proved catastrophically fragile during the COVID pandemic and subsequent disruptions. This is directly analogous to Rome's specialized trade-dependent economy collapsing when currency instability made long-distance commerce impossible. The warning signs are everywhere. Real wages adjusted for actual inflation, rather than official statistics, have been stagnant or declining for decades in many developed nations. Productivity growth, the engine of genuine prosperity, has slowed dramatically. Debt levels, government, corporate, and household, have reached historically unprecedented levels. Political polarization is intensifying as different groups fight over a pie that's no longer growing. But here's what should truly concern you. The same psychological patterns of denial are operating. Politicians across the spectrum promise solutions that require no sacrifices that someone else will pay for. Central bankers insist they have everything under control, that monetary policy can manage any crisis. Mainstream economists provide sophisticated justifications for policies that, stripped of jargon, are simply variations on printing money and borrowing from the future. And the general public, like Romans in the 5th century, continues with daily life, assuming that the system is fundamentally stable because it's been stable within living memory. The parallels extend to proposed solutions. Rome tried price controls. We try rent control and minimum wage laws. Rome tried to force people to stay in their trades through legislation. We try occupational licensing and credential inflation. Rome tried to maintain the fiction of imperial authority long after the reality had vanished. Modern governments try to maintain the fiction of fiscal sustainability through accounting tricks and optimistic projections. None of it addresses the core problem. You cannot sustain a complex economy on a foundation of currency, debasement, and ever-increasing debt. Economic reality eventually intrudes. The question isn't whether, but when. Some argue that technology, particularly artificial intelligence and automation, will create enough productivity growth to solve these problems. Perhaps, but betting your financial future on hoped-for technological salvation is a gamble, not a plan. Others point to modern institutions like central banks and international financial systems as safeguards that didn't exist in Rome. But these institutions are run by humans, subject to the same political pressures and cognitive biases, and the more complex the system, the more potential failure points exist. The lesson from Rome isn't that collapse is inevitable or imminent. It's that the patterns leading to collapse are recognizable, and they're present now. The sophisticated Roman of 450 AD, who recognized these patterns and acted to protect himself and his family, fared far better than those who trusted that the empire would endure. Let's bring together the historical, philosophical, psychological, and economic threads we've explored and translate them into practical understanding and action. The core insight is this: economic systems fail through a combination of fiscal irresponsibility, currency debasement, declining productivity, and collective denial. These factors reinforce each other in a downward spiral that can remain hidden for decades before culminating in rapid collapse. Rome's experience teaches us that the time to prepare is when everything seems fine, not when the crisis becomes obvious. By the time collapse is apparent to everyone, it's too late to protect yourself. So, what does this mean practically? First, develop what we might call economic humility. Accept that you cannot predict exactly when or how systemic problems will manifest, but you can recognize warning signs and act to reduce your vulnerability. This means avoiding the normalcy bias that keeps most people complacent until disaster strikes. Second, understand the difference between nominal wealth and real wealth. Your net worth in dollars, euros, or any fiat currency is only as solid as the currency itself. Real wealth consists of productive assets, skills, relationships, and tangible value that persists regardless of currency fluctuations or system changes. What are productive assets? Land, especially agricultural land, retains value through economic disruptions. Businesses that provide essential goods or services continue generating wealth even when financial systems are chaotic. Commodities like precious metals aren't subject to currency debasement. Investments in your own skills and knowledge cannot be inflated away. Third, diversification isn't just about spreading money across different stocks. It's about diversifying across asset classes, currencies, even geographic regions. The Romans, who had estates both inside and outside the empire's borders, who held wealth in various forms, survived the collapse far better than those whose wealth was concentrated in Roman currency or property in the city of Rome itself. Fourth, reduce debt exposure. In inflationary periods, debt can seem advantageous. You repay in devalued currency. But during systemic collapse, the legal and social framework that allows strategic default often breaks down. Creditors become aggressive. Courts may not function. Debt that seemed manageable can become catastrophic. Fifth, invest in resilience. This means developing skills that remain valuable in disrupted economies. Technical skills, agricultural knowledge, repair abilities, medical training, these human capabilities retain value regardless of what happens to financial systems. The Romans, who could provide genuine value to new barbarian kingdoms, transitioned successfully. Those whose status derived entirely from the old system lost everything. Sixth, build networks and community. Economic collapse is survivable with strong social connections. Isolated individuals, no matter how wealthy, are vulnerable. Communities that trust each other and cooperate can weather storms that would destroy atomized populations. Seventh, stay informed but think independently. The mainstream narrative will always lag reality. Official sources have incentives to downplay risks and maintain confidence. Learn to interpret economic data yourself. Understand the difference between nominal statistics and real conditions. Eighth, accept that you might be early. The Romans, who recognized the empire's terminal decline in 400 AD, had to wait 76 years for vindication. Being right about long-term trends while being early in timing can be financially and psychologically painful. It's far preferable to being late. The so what of Rome's collapse is that complex systems can and do fail, that warning signs are visible long before final collapse, and that those who recognize and act on these signs can protect themselves and even thrive through transitions that destroy others. But let's reframe our initial question. Did Rome really fall in 3 days? In one sense, yes, the formal end came quickly. In another sense, no, the fall was centuries in the making. The truth is, both long, slow decay punctuated by sudden collapse. This is the pattern to watch for in any economic system. Gradual deterioration that most people normalize and ignore, followed by rapid dramatic failure that seems to come out of nowhere but was actually entirely predictable. Your task is to avoid being the Roman citizen of 476 AD who's shocked that the empire could disappear. Instead, be the person who recognized the patterns, prepared accordingly, and had the resources and skills to navigate whatever came next. The economic philosopher isn't about predicting exactly when or how current systems will face crises. It's about understanding the patterns that lead to crises, recognizing when those patterns are present, and giving you the frameworks to think clearly about protecting yourself and building genuine wealth that persists through disruption. Rome's greatest downfall offers its greatest lesson. Economic reality always wins. Governments can deny it, propagandists can spin it, the majority can ignore it. But eventually, mathematics and human nature assert themselves. The question is whether you'll recognize this truth before or after it becomes undeniable to everyone. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you see parallels between Rome's economic trajectory and current conditions? What warning signs concern you most? Are you taking any steps to reduce your vulnerability to potential economic disruption? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This community thrives on substantive discussion, and I read every comment. Let's learn from each other's perspectives and experiences. If this exploration of economic history and its modern implications provided value, subscribe to the Economic Philosopher for more deep dives into the forces shaping our economic future. We're building a community of people who think independently about these critical issues. And check out our video on the psychology of financial bubbles and market mania, where we explore how collective delusion creates and destroys wealth. It complements today's discussion perfectly. Understanding history doesn't guarantee you'll predict the future, but it dramatically improves your odds of recognizing patterns before they become catastrophes. This is the Economic Philosopher, where history, psychology, and economics converge to help you navigate an uncertain world. Until next time, think independently, prepare wisely, and remember, Owe wasn't built in a day, but it fell in 3.